Guys, now back with another video. This one is entitled Oversight of the Securities and Exchange Commission. Basically, Gary Gensler is going to get his butt screwed, possibly. I don't know how hard they're going to go with some of the questions, but listen. Let's get started.
The committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. The hearing is titled Oversight of the Securities and Exchange Commission. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous material to the chair for inclusion in the record. I now recognize myself for 4 minutes to give an opening statement. Welcome back, Chairman Gensler. Last time you were before the committee, I voiced my concerns regarding your reckless approach to rulemaking, lack of capital formation agenda, a crusade against the digital asset ecosystem, and unresponsiveness to Congress. So many things change, so many things remain the same. Those are the same issues on the docket today. This means that in the last 5 months, you've done nothing to remedy the legitimate and often bipartisan concern expressed by this committee and these committee members. That is disgraceful. So let's run through them again. Let me be clear, Chairman Gensler, our patience is wearing thin. First, the Securities and Exchange Commission's current approach to rulemaking jeopardizes the integrity of our financial markets and puts investors at risk. There's a critical need for comprehensive economic analysis of the rules you've proposed and their interaction with one another. Under your leadership, the Commission has failed to adequately assess their interplay and cumulative impact. That's shoddy work for an important agency and does not adhere to the SEC's mandatory statutory authority. While the Securities and Exchange Commission is engaged in a wide-ranging regulatory agenda, you seem to have overlooked the importance of public input, resulting in bipartisan bicameral concerns. Members of both sides of the aisle have raised valid concerns regarding the MiFID relief, swing pricing, hard close, as well as your equity market structure overhaul. The Securities and Exchange Commission has taken no action to address these concerns. Second, you continue to fail to prioritize capital formation. Among your expansive rulemaking agenda items, there is not a single initiative aimed at improving access to capital or enhancing market competitiveness. Third, your efforts to choke off the digital asset ecosystem, which has created real harm for consumers and our markets, is clear to all. You said the law is clear, but your actions have created more confusion and lasting damage. Chair Gensler, you've also said your goal is consumer protection.
Yeah, right.
Yet your actions have pushed legitimate digital asset activities outside of regulated financial institutions where consumers are best protected. On one hand, we've seen bipartisan votes in Congress, in this committee, to provide clear rules of the road and real consumer protection. And on the other, we've seen your ad hoc regulation by enforcement approach to digital assets on a losing streak in the courts. You refuse to be transparent with Congress regarding your interactions with FTX and Sam Bankman-Fried. That's the investigation we started last Congress. Finally, your lack of responsiveness to this committee's legitimate oversight continues to be unacceptable. And I want to finish here. In February, the committee made multiple requests for documents to the Securities and Exchange Commission. This is normal congressional oversight. Yet 7 months later, the committee has not received a single non-public document that was not part of a FOIA production. As I said, our patience is wearing thin. The SEC is not above the law, nor is it unique. Other financial regulators have routinely complied with congressional oversight. So let me be clear. I do not want to be the first chairman of this committee to issue a subpoena to the Securities and Exchange Commission. And you should not want to be the first SEC chair to receive a congressional subpoena. Either we find a path forward where the SEC recognizes Congress as a co-equal branch of government and is responsive to our oversight duties, or my option is to issue a subpoena. It's time for you to consider the lasting consequences of your actions, and what that means to the Securities and Exchange Commission's reputation long term. While your time in this role may be temporary, the repercussions for your actions may be permanent for the agency. I yield back. Now recognize the ranking member of the committee for 4 minutes for an opening statement.
Good morning. The chairman just indicated that his patience is running thin. Mine is thinner with the opposite side of the aisle and the extreme MAGA Republicans who have taken over the House of Representatives and who are gleefully forcing the government of the greatest country in the world to shut down and forcing millions of government workers, including U.S. service members protecting the economy, to work for free or not at all. Likewise, in 3 days, the Securities and Exchange Commission, which is in charge of overseeing our $110 trillion capital markets, will also be shuttered. This extreme MAGA shutdown would cripple the SEC's ability to stop fraud, help businesses raise money, or finalize rules that are critical to investors. But you won't hear the Republicans today express any concern about the SEC or the countless businesses, workers, or investors that may be harmed when Republicans unilaterally defund Wall Street's cop. Chair Gensler, I know that you and your agency are likely concerned about what will happen later this week. I too am concerned. Earlier this year, we saw Fitch downgrade the U.S. credit rating after Republicans tried to force a default. And now Moody's is also considering downgrading the U.S. rating if Republicans and Trump get the shutdown they so desperately want. I hope we can discuss today how undermining the SEC's mission by furloughing 90% of your staff will affect this country and your ability to protect our markets. That said, I want you to know that you're doing exactly the job that the American people want. Under your leadership, the SEC is providing investors with the information they need to evaluate climate change risk. You're reforming the stock market, which failed investors during the GameStop trading event. And you're working to empower investors to exercise their votes over companies they own. I'm also pleased to see that you're finalizing rules that will bring transparency to private funds, like private equity funds. And although Republicans will likely claim that the SEC is implementing too many rules too quickly, the fact is that you're moving thoughtfully and effectively. In fact, your SEC has issued fewer rules than the Trump, Obama, and Bush administrations at this point in their tenure, and you've provided twice as much time to comment than is required by law. The SEC is very much implementing the priorities that I and my Democratic colleagues championed when we were in charge, and is shaping up to be the most pro-worker, pro-investor, pro-small business SEC since FDR created the agency. Chair Gensler, I appreciate that you're here today, even as you and your staff prepare to close the agency. I hope that if nothing else comes of this hearing, the American people will understand that this extreme MAGA Republican shutdown is the biggest threat to our nation's investors, small businesses, and working families. My patient is wearing thinner than the chairman's patient. Let's get on with it.
Oh, nasty.
I yield back.
The ranking member yields back. The chair recognizes Ms. Wagner, the chairman of the Subcommittee on Capital Markets, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Chairman McHenry. Yes, let's get on with it. The SEC's mission is to protect investors, maintain fair, orderly, and efficient markets, and facilitate capital formation. Unfortunately, your leadership has undermined these core objectives, sir. None of the 50-odd proposals your SEC has proposed promotes capital formation. Instead, the focus has shifted towards imposing costly regulatory and disclosure requirements. Equally troubling and potential violations of the Administrative Procedure Act, as recent SEC proposals lack a comprehensive analysis of market dynamics and their consequences, especially for SEC rules that have been changed. Here's the way forward, sir. 1, begin with robust engagement with market participants to shape your thinking before proposing rules. 2, conduct investor testing. 3, economic analysis. And looking at not just the individuals, but the cumulative. 4, do not ignore Congress. when you send bipartisan letters expressing concerns about detrimental effects of the proposals. We need market integrity. I yield back.
We'll now recognize the ranking member of the Capital Market Subcommittee, Mr. Sherman of California, for 1 minute.
Mr. Gensler, you've done more than anyone in government to thwart the creation of an efficient ecosystem that will allow corrupt politicians to not have to have hundreds of thousands of dollars of cash and gold bars in their home when they could be discovered by the FBI. You prevented a system where we can have anonymous, unhosted wallets providing an efficient method for the corrupt politicians of the future. You are providing additional regulations which provide clarity to market participants and protect investors. But according to a Bloomberg study, you're actually producing fewer regulations than your predecessor, recent predecessors. You're generally right, except swing pricing. And finally, ESG is material to investors. It will affect trillions of dollars of investment decisions. That's why corporate America is trying to prevent you from getting that information to the investors who want it.
Gentleman's time's expired. We'll now recognize the chair of the Securities and Exchange Commission.
Good morning.
For 5 minutes for an oral presentation of his testimony. Without objection, your written statement will be made a part of the record. Chair Gensler, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chair McHenry, Ranking Member Waters, and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me here today. As is customary, I'd like to note that my views are my own as chair of the SEC, and I am not speaking on behalf of my fellow commissioners or the SEC staff. For 90 years, the federal securities laws and our work to oversee them have played a crucial role for the public, both in good times and in stress times. The core principles of the U.S. securities markets regulation have contributed to America's economic success and geopolitical standing. At this remarkable agency, we serve investors building for a better future and issuers raising money to fund innovation while overseeing the $100 trillion capital markets where investors and issuers meet. The essence of this captured in our three-part mission: protecting investors, maintaining fair, orderly, efficient markets in the middle, and facilitating capital formation, as Chair Wagner mentioned earlier and Chair McHenry. The SEC is the cop on the beat watching out for constituents. The dedicated staff of the agency does an extraordinary job with limited resources. America is blessed with the largest, most sophisticated, and most innovative capital markets in the world, but we cannot take this for granted. Even a gold medalist must keep training. That's why we're updating our rules for the technology and business models of the 2020s. My written testimony details those efforts, and I'm sure I'll get questions on this rule or that rule, but I'd like to just point out overall a context. We're updating our rules to promote the efficiency, integrity, and resiliency of the middle, the markets in the middle, and that helps capital formation on one side, investors on the other, and we do so with an eye on those investors and issuers and making sure the markets work for them rather than issuers and investors working for Wall Street and the markets in the middle. We're working to help lower cost, increase access, and promote financial stability, and each of the proposals we've made in the last 2 years further this three-part mission, given the authorities granted by Congress. And our Division of Economic and Risk Analysis provides robust economic analysis, which consider the cost and benefits, as well as effects on efficiency, competition, and capital formation as Congress mandated. We greatly benefit also from public input regarding economics, the policies themselves, our legal authorities, and we get that feedback. And in the last 2 years, we've provided the public ample time to comment, with an average 70 days to comment from the time the proposal is published. And since January of last year, 22, we've always had a minimum of 60 days from when it's on our website, sometimes as long as 100 days. When comment periods close, we often continue to get additional comments through meetings and otherwise, which staff has considered as well, including really helpful letters from members of this committee. Based on the public feedback, the staff and the commission consider possible adjustments to the proposals and whether it's appropriate to move forward with the final rule. This process normally takes 12 to 24 months. And we move to adopt rules only when the staff and the commission think they are ready to be considered. We're focused on getting it right based upon the economics, the authorities, promoting the mission, not against a clock. The SEC now has issued proposals for most of that unified agenda from 2 years ago. We finalized 24 rulemakings, nearly all of which have changed from the proposals based on the public feedback, including from members of this committee. I'm grateful to work alongside a remarkable staff and fellow commissioners to promote efficiency, integrity, and resiliency. With the possibility of a government shutdown, I would note, as our oversight committee, that we would be down to a small skeletal staff, about 7-8% of our staff, everybody else being furloughed. Normal oversight of the markets, given this, will not be possible in the SEC during the pendency of a shutdown. So we look forward to the day when we can get back to work, hopefully, and fulfill our mission in support of the public. Thank you.
Furlough means they still get
Chairman
paid.
yields back. Will now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Chair Gensler, last time we were here, I asked you about Ether. In 2018, you say that Bitcoin, Ether, Litecoin, and Bitcoin Cash are not securities. So I want to focus today on Bitcoin. Why do you believe Bitcoin is not a security?
Thank you, Chair, and I think you're referencing remarks I made as a professor at MIT. And as I wrote in that paper at that time, it was really about something called the Howey test. And the Supreme Court, it's the law of the land, talks about if the public is anticipating a profit based on the efforts of others. And as I think I noted in that paper back in 2018, I didn't see that Bitcoin
But your view on Bitcoin, you've made comments on this. You believe Bitcoin is not a security. Is that true?
Well, I think the staff of the SEC have also, and the prior chair.
I'm just asking you this question, and this is not a gotcha. I thought there was going to be an easy softball into harder questions. Do you think Bitcoin is a security?
No, I think I've said this in the past that I think that it doesn't
I'm asking you
meet the
to
Howey
answer
test.
my question now. This is not supposed to be hard.
I know, I said it
Just
does
to answer-
not meet the Howey test, which is the
Okay.
law of the land about being an
So
investment
it doesn't meet the
contract.
Howey test. So therefore, it's a commodity. Is that fair?
I would say it's not a security, and then the test is otherwise for other
Okay.
laws.
Well, the CFTC says they don't have the authority over Bitcoin and digital commodities. Do you think legislation is necessary to protect consumers in the world of digital assets, in particular, given that gap around just Bitcoin?
I think, as I've testified here in this committee room 4 years ago as a private citizen, that for the parts of the crypto ecosystem that are not securities, though under the Commodities Exchange Act, the CFTC has some anti-fraud authorities, they don't have what's called plenary authority to write rules around that. And as I've said in the past, I've been supportive of our sister agency, if I can say that, an agency that I once was honored to chair and I like quite a bit, doesn't have that plenary authority, and if Congress moved forward on that, that could help them.
So, the spot market lacks a regulatory paradigm and established law. So, should we take action there?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I follow. The U.S. stock market you're talking about, the securities
No,
market?
the CFTC. I'm continuing with your answer. My follow-up there was because there's not a regulatory remit that Congress has given them, clear regulatory remit, we should step in. So let me just move on. I've talked about your non-compliance with document requests made by this committee. You believe the commission must vote in order to produce non-public information to this committee. Do you not?
Under the Exchange Act, I do believe that the commission needs
So,
that vote.
have you scheduled a vote necessary to provide the non-public documents to this committee?
We, I think, have been working with your staff and believe in oversight of this committee, we've provided somewhere over 40,000 pages
Yes,
of
nothing,
documents.
as I said in my opening statement, nothing that was non-public did you provide. In fact, you produced one of the letters that we wrote to you as responsive documents. It showed the absurdity of it. So the General Counsel's Office has indicated to my staff that after a 10-week review process, these documents are ready to be transmitted. It just needs a vote. When do you intend to schedule that vote?
We continue to work with you and your staff. We've had, the commission has approved that some senior staff will be taking transcribed interviews, I think, with your staff.
But that is not responsive to my document requests. This should not be the hard work of a chairman to answer these questions. You have 30 major rulemakings, but you won't even provide basic documents to us. Your unresponsiveness is non-compliance, and we'll have to take action if you're not willing to comply. You have a 10-week review process, and you've not provided documents. Furthermore, you haven't even done the economic analysis of your interplay of these major rulemakings that are going to affect anybody who owns a stock, bond, or any type of security. And so you've got serious questions to answer to the public and to Congress, and we intend to get your compliance. We can do it the easy way or the hard way. And with that, I yield back. The ranking member is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. There are a number of questions that I would like to ask, but since we started out on Bitcoins, let's go further into crypto. Chair Gensler, I've heard you often say there is mass non-compliance by crypto firms in the marketplace today. I'm very concerned with what sounds like gross violations of the law that end in investors getting ripped off. The failures and fraud of crypto firms like Terra Luna, for example, cost investors as much as $60 billion, which was larger than the Madoff Ponzi scheme in 2008. I know that the SEC has brought enforcement actions against Sam Bankman-Fried and FTX, the failure of which cost investors $9 billion. Since we're talking about everything today, can you please describe the actions that the SEC has taken to shut down crypto firms and recover funds for harmed investors? How much in penalties have defendants paid in cases you have settled? Are crypto firms getting the message?
Thank you. I do share your concerns that this is a field that's rife with fraud, and manipulation, and scams, and the American public is still getting hurt by the non-compliance in this field. In terms of the SEC's approach, it's both through policy and rulemaking and, yes, in enforcement. The SEC had finalized rules with regard to special purpose broker-dealers in crypto, and we also addressed questions that came up about crypto exchanges, the custody of crypto in a custody rule that I imagine we'll chat a little bit about later today, and even best execution. But unfortunately, as you noted, we've brought numerous cases in this field to try to protect the American public and be a cop on the beat with regard to so many of these schemes.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to make sure that the opposite side of the aisle, who protects too often in too many different ways crypto firms, that they know what you're doing. Let me move on. I'm going to ask a few questions about the impact of the government shutdown on SEC's operation. Chair Gensler, approximately how many people work at the agency and what percentage will be furloughed during a government shutdown?
We have just under 5,000 employees, and probably 92 or 3% will be furloughed. So we'll be down to a skeletal staff.
Which divisions would most be impacted, and describe for us what these divisions do?
It's really across the whole agency, but the bulk of our workforce is in examinations, in enforcement, in disclosure review. But let me say what the public won't have. They won't have somebody really at full force overseeing the market. For companies that want to go public, we won't be able to really review the documents, or what's called documents going effective if you want to do an initial public offering, which is so critical to capital formation. We will keep open, I want to say this for the public, we will keep open our tips, complaint, and referral lines. We will keep open comment files so people can still submit comments on our rulemaking. and the like, but we won't really have individuals behind the scenes to follow up, except
I
for
too am
skeletal
worried
staff.
about public offerings. I've worked with the opposite side of the aisle to improve the ability of those who want to do IPOs. But as you explain it, this will have a negative impact, the shutdown on the ability for IPOs to be initiated. Is that correct?
I think that's just a practical reality, yes.
What happens if a whistleblower comes to the commission with urgent information that could protect investors? Would there be staff to process this? Could the commission deploy resources in response to this information?
Though we will be able to intake, there won't be the usual investigative force of individuals to follow up as readily unless it's an emergency and it's about specifically protection of property.
What will happen if there's a major disruption in the capital markets operations and infrastructure during the shutdown? Could the SEC be there to respond?
It's a very good question. I mean, if there were a market event, as you say, senior leadership would be there, but again, we'd be down to a skeletal staff.
And so
Gentlelady's time's expired. We'll now go to the Vice Chair of the full committee, Mr. Hill of Arkansas, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Gensler, it's good to have you. I want to start out today and talk about equity market structure as a topic. Just yesterday, Congressman Foster and I sent you a letter signed by 16 Democrats and 16 Republicans to express our concerns about the equity market structure proposals that the Commission has initiated. The letter urges you quite simply to stop your rulemaking on that broad set of proposals until you finalize the trade execution data rule, the so-called 605 data rule, and that be done first so that you can rely on that data for an appropriate rulemaking. And this speaks to Mr. McHenry's point about the interplay between the rules, which, contrary to the ranking member, I think there are 50 pending proposals. Many of them interact. They are confusing and sometimes in conflict with each other, and I think this is a classic example. And I think it's particularly true where you're failing to do a rigorous cost-benefit analysis for many of the rules. For instance, the SEC's dealer proposal, which uses the word uncertain 15 times to describe its impact on efficiency and competition for the most important financial market in the world, U.S. Treasuries. So, Mr. Chairman, I would just say this is not MAGA Republicans that are sending you a critical letter of concern. It's a very bipartisan view, 32 members of this body that think the SEC should reconsider. Would you wait for the Rule 605 data before you finish the other equity market proposals?
I thank you for the letter. I did read it last night around 9:30 when it came in. And it's part of our comment file. We'll take it and think of it very seriously. But I would say in terms of the equity markets, the rules have largely not been updated since 2005.
That may be, but that means that we need to do it in a comprehensive way, in an interoperative way, and make sure we have the right data. So I'll take your short answer as no that it's a comment, but I really urge you to get these equity markets proposals in order and to rely on data and not just emotion or one meme stock event to make policy. Let me change subjects. Let me talk about my favorite kitty cat, which is the CAT, Consolidated Audit Trail. For over a decade, this bad idea has been floating around the Commission since the flash crash in 2010 to collect and store private personal information on every American and every American with a brokerage account at every broker-dealer. In my view, this is a massive overkill. This is unnecessary invasion of privacy. This is a massive new tax on the brokerage account of individual American citizens. And maybe worst of all, considering the 9 years I've been here, this is another massive centralized government database that's going to be hacked, like the IRS, like the CFPB, like OPM. And so I've got real concerns about it, and I continue to express those for Mary Jo White, for Mr. Clayton, and now for you. In fact, you inherited this albatross. Why don't you just bury it and say that we're not going to do the CAT?
Though I inherited not only from them, but I inherited from my dad a real allergy to cats, and it's real.
Oh my God.
Oh my God.
Yeah. Well, we don't have time for that. I'm reclaiming my time. We can have a cat visit. We can do the kitty part later. Do you know what a targeted exam letter is by the FINRA? Do you know what that is?
I'm familiar with exam letters.
Yep. And do you know what a blue sheet is?
Sir, I'm generally familiar. I don't know where you're headed, but I'm generally familiar.
And you know that all of our markets have regular daily, intraday, overnight global market surveillance on trading, right? That's a general feature of all of our SROs, right? You agree with that?
SROs are responsible to do that, sir.
Yeah, I understand that. And you regulate the SROs. So what I'm suggesting to you is there's no justification for capturing all these trades when you have right now market surveillance data available to enforcement division. And you can right now do a sweep exam through a blue sheet, which is where you go to large traders and you look at everybody who traded in Apple. You can get all the PII you want because you have a probable cause for doing that. And that's why CAT, I think, exceeds what you should be doing. Why is the blue sheet targeted exam process inadequate for you to do your job?
So I think you raise a good question, but the consolidated audit trail gives the self-regulatory organizations and the SEC a look at those orders and matches up sometimes.
They've got the ability to do that now. They don't need to capture everybody's trade in every retail brokerage account in America. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. We'll now recognize the ranking member of the Capital Markets Subcommittee, Mr. Sherman of California.
As the chairman points out, it's about capital formation. You're at the nerve center of the world capitalist system, where capital is deployed to operating businesses. If we have a shutdown of the government, I think it's already been pointed out by the ranking member that we stop all IPOs in their tracks. Does this also apply to companies that are already public but are issuing additional shares? And does it also apply to new bond issuances?
I'm glad to follow up and have staff chat with you. It's more nuanced. It really depends on whether they have filings that they can.
So a few of them are sophisticated.
Many would still, many public companies would be foreclosed from doing additional offerings. Others would be allowed. It really depends on the nature of their filings.
So a huge portion of our $100 trillion capital markets are not available to raise additional capital, or a huge portion of the initial capital that would be raised for operating businesses would be blocked. We also, as I understand, as far as providing assurance for the honesty of markets, you'll continue to collect emails as they come in, but you won't be doing any investigations or opening any additional investigatory files, correct?
It's really prescribed and narrow. It relates to a 19th century law called the Inefficiency Act, but we can protect public property. But it's
okay.
It's really
so nobody's going to be stealing your computers, but you're not going to be. It's going to be the Wild West on Wall Street, all while we're fighting for capital with other countries and other capital market systems. And we put up a sign that says, closed. I can't think of a worse thing we could do to American capitalism. Swing pricing, I think it doesn't achieve its purpose. We should want people to invest in mutual funds and diversify and invest in America. But the swing pricing rule you've put forward has been criticized by a letter signed by the vast majority of Democrats on the Capital Markets Subcommittee, many Republicans, I think the vast majority there, the Consumer Federation of America. It seems to be an unfair rule in that giant players can participate in CITs rather than mutual funds, get the same benefits, not be subject to this rule. Investors will be told you may not get your net asset value. People who live in the Pacific time zone are disadvantaged. Any chance you'll be taking this rule back to the drawing board?
We've got a lot of comments. I'm very familiar with the letter that you and Representative Wagner co-authored. It's really going at a core feature that when you have a mutual fund, if you redeem in that mutual fund, you should redeem at the right price so that the remaining shareholders don't get dilution. It works well in normal times, less well in stress times, but we're taking all of these into consideration.
I understand. I'll simply point out that for many years, thousands of mutual funds, all competing for capital, could have adopted this rule. And not a single one of them thought, oh, this is what investors want. This is what will seem fair to investors. You've got the safeguarding rule. I'll simply comment that I think we need a safeguarding rule for intangible assets. I would hope that you would, if you feel that tangible assets such as real estate need a safeguarding rule, that you would write a separate rule. Is the safeguarding rule that you're writing pretty much structured around intangible assets such as crypto?
No, its genesis, it came from Congress itself. It was part of Dodd-Frank 12, 13 years ago. There was a new provision that the SEC addressed the custody of all customer assets by investment advisors. So it expanded it from just funds and securities to all assets. That was the genesis.
I would hope that the rule would have separate sections and a completely different approach for real estate on the one hand and crypto on the other. Real estate is the title is public and the asset isn't moving anywhere, and intangible assets and crypto are very different. I believe my time has expired.
It does have separate sections, but we'll take that under advisement, and it's so good to see Representative.
Gentleman's time's expired. We'll now recognize the gentleman from Oklahoma making his valiant return after tussling with a bull.
Yes, sir.
Happy to have you back, Frank.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I very much appreciate that. And I would note to my colleagues, it has been a long time since I've sat this far down in a committee hearing. But after my interaction with the 1,000-pound bull, I'm just happy to be here. So with that, thank you. And I have the
ask unanimous
opportunity.
consent to restore the gentleman's time. We're happy to have you back.
Thank you. And my opportunity to visit with my old friend from many encounters and many discussions. Before I begin my questions, I'd like to reiterate a few points made in the bipartisan letter that I sent regarding the SEC's two proposed rulemakings on security-based swaps and security loans. And I'd like to enter that letter into the record, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection.
These proposals, I believe, could impair market liquidity while increasing risks and costs. And to avoid unintended negative consequences, the SEC should study the data for regulatory purposes before moving forward with public dissemination. This is consistent with the Dodd-Frank Act, and I hope the Commission will give serious consideration to this approach. Now, Chairman Gensler, I'd like to focus on the proposed rule branded as the Safeguarding Advisory Client Assets. The proposed rule would impose requirements that are inconsistent with the CFTC rules, and you've spent a good bit of time working on CFTC rules in a past life, and would indirectly give the SEC, I fear, authority over the CFTC's regulated markets. And in addition to being outside of the SEC's authority, this would create the significant problems, I think, across the entire financial markets. Have you consulted with the CFTC on the impact of the proposed rule? And if so, for curiosity, what was their feedback?
First, Representative Lucas, it's so good to see you. And your letter with regard to securities-based swaps not only gained my attention, but there are many people at the SEC. I would say this is Representative Lucas's letter. Will you please take a close look at it?
Thank you.
But on your topic and your question about safeguarding of assets, the staff has consulted with fellow regulators at the CFTC about that safeguarding rule, taken their thoughts into consideration. We're some time away. I mean, this was only proposed earlier this year, and it usually takes 12 to 24 months before we even consider adoption. But I think that there are paths forward in terms of the intersection between their Rule 1.25 and these custody rules.
I just think it's imperative that the SEC refrain from applying the proposal to CFTC regulated markets. And I hope that you'll be able to commit to that, even if it means perhaps at some point withdrawing the rule entirely. Now, second question. The Commission has also recently proposed a rule regarding the use of predictive data analytics used by broker-dealers and investment advisors. The proposed rule casts a broad net over what is considered a covered technology. And I quote directly from the rule. A covered technology is defined as an analytical, technological, computational function, an algorithm, model, a correlation matrix, or singular method of process that optimizes, predicts, guides, forecasts, or directs investment-related behaviors or outcomes. What a mouthful. The included economic analysis explains that the rule would require a substantial resources to comply with and would prevent smaller firms from entering the market or adopting new technology at all. So, Chair Gensler, could you clarify what technologies are covered, and is the intent of the rule to make it difficult for firms to employ certain kinds of technology?
The intent of the rule, A, is to be technology neutral, and it's only about one really core thing, is that when investment advisors or broker-dealers interact with investors, that interaction, that if they're using, as you said, a covered technology, but predictive data analytics, that they continue to put the investor's interest ahead of their own, and they not, in reverse, put the investment advisor's interest ahead of the investing public. That's the core of this proposal.
I'd simply add that given the rapid advances in machine learning and generative AI, the United States should lead the way in the development of innovative technologies that would unlock new economic opportunities, and we should be careful not to be so hostile to new technologies that we stop innovation in its tracks. With that, I'll simply say thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to Mr. Chairman, I spent 7 weeks being calm and at home. I've not been that calm and that long at home since 1986. I'm happy to be back with all of you. And with you, Mr. Chairman, you're back.
Well, Frank, we're happy to have you back. And as a former chair of current chair of one and a former chair of another committee, we honored the old bulls.
And I missed the ranking member, too.
We'll now recognize another ranking member of full committee, Mr. Meeks in New York, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Chairman Gensler, for appearing before us today. Over the course of the last few months, I've had the opportunity to both ask the SEC's Director of the Division of Economic and Risk Analysis and the Director of the Division of Investment Management about the private funds rules. In particular, I've asked about revisiting the economic analysis to ensure that it adequately considered the disparate impact on emerging minority and women-owned asset management firms, minority and women-owned businesses, and historically underinvested communities. Dr. Wachter assured me that the SEC shared my concerns, and Director Berthistle testified that the economic impact analysis was expanded to look into these concerns. So my question to you, can you confirm that the economic analysis was expanded? And if so, can you speak to the specific changes that were made in response to the findings from that expanded analysis?
The rule, as other rules do, considers the effect on small businesses. And in this rule, particularly, the economic analysis looked about small businesses, including those that are women-owned and minority-owned, investment advisors running private funds.
So I would like to follow up on that, but I got so many questions I want to ask you because it is really important about the get more details of what those findings were. But I'll ask you more about that in writing and get a response, because I want to shift to a related issue that I find to be disturbing. On page 553 of the private funds rules, the Commission seems to seriously suggest that smaller investment advisors, who we know are likely to be predominantly minority and women-owned, consider reducing their assets under management to avoid registering with the SEC to help mitigate the impact of the rule to them. Mr. Chairman, we know that minority-owned firms are 3 to 4 times more likely to fund minority enterprises and their portfolio companies. So wouldn't telling these firms to stifle their own growth perpetuate the lack of diverse representation in the industry and therefore decrease the amount of funding going to diverse entrepreneurs?
As the economic analysis noted and you just read, there are often some firms, whether it's in a rule like this or other rules, that are right at a cutoff point, where they might be registered and regulated and not, that they might make different choices. But overall, this rule is actually really helpful because it promotes competition and transparency. The biggest fund managers would have to provide greater transparency to their investors, and the smaller asset managers can actually benefit from that greater transparency and competition around the side letters that they might be cutting with large asset pension funds and the like. So it's really a balancing of these economic considerations. It was pro-capital formation, it was pro-investor because it promotes transparency in the middle of the market, that asset managers would have transparency about their fees, their performance, and these so-called side letters that they enter into.
Well, I just have problems with it because it seems to me, again, you're telling these asset managers to not grow, to continue to build where they can do more because of the people that they serve. So it's an issue for me, but of which I'll follow up on. Under your leadership, the SEC has been, incredibly active, and I'll leave it to others to discuss the pace and the breadth of the Commission's rulemaking. But what I wonder is whether or not the SEC considers how their proposed rules will interact with existing and draft rules during the rulemaking process, particularly when it comes to economic impact of the finalized and pending rules. And do you think there would be any value to doing a whole holistic analysis?
We do. In each economic analysis, which often runs between 100 and 250 pages, each of those considers other rules that may have been adopted and adjusts the baseline in each of those analyses.
We'll now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Sessions, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. And I appreciate the gentleman, my friend, Mr. Meeks, for his conversation with Chairman. Chairman, welcome once again to the committee.
Good to see you, sir.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I think that there's a lot of happy talk and smiling that takes place from you and your agency as they come up here and they try and talk about two principles of listening to stakeholders and industry participation, and yet I think you're hearing across this committee a wish that we could have a better relationship with you and your entire organization, and we have prodded them, sent letters, done everything nice that you can do, and yet we show up here and we find a way to provide feedback. We'd like to sincerely turn that around. As you know, you and I spoke a couple of years ago about an issue that still is unresolved because the SEC would not even let this firm know what their problem was. And you told me it will take at least 214 days because that's how long it takes us before we're able to turn issues around when your Fort Worth office already knew the answer. And I think it's this kind of action on behalf of the SEC that causes members of Congress to react the way we do. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to turn to an issue. Last November, the SEC announced a massive increase in enforcement fines, $6.4 billion in 22, up from $3.8 billion in 21. and you have launched a regulatory crusade against the financial service industry through enforcement. You've told us that. We see this. Can you please tell me what the money from these enforcement actions, what you've done with it, and where that money goes?
First, sir, if I may, I think the matter you talked to me about a week or so ago, we filed a civil litigated matter against that company. So I think that's all a matter of public record.
Well, then I've learned that now. Thank you. But for the 2 years prior to that, there was attempted to be resolution, and you even blocked that company from their counsel, who was very capable, from engaging in that, knowing what that was, where they could have corrected that or found a way to work with it, because it put at least $50 million directly at risk. Mr. Chairman, can you explain where the money from these enforcement penalties is winding up?
There's a number of places. Much of it goes into what's called fair funds. Congress helps set up a process where the public can actually get money back. Those that are harmed can get money back. And some of the penalties and so forth, go into the U.S. Treasury. So that some in fair funds and back to those that have been hurt, but some, of course, also into the U.S. Treasury.
So the SEC takes the money in, follows the laws that have been established, and that is...
Yeah, we're funded separately. We're appropriated, and then we're funded by fees that are fees on transactions in the...
Yes, sir. I just wanted to make sure that it's as a result of what Congress has established with the fair funds about what they would do with that money. Your testimony today is that's what you've done with the $6.4 billion.
Not all of it, sir.
Well, then please tell me what
we can
add a comma and add the rest.
No, we can follow up with the details, because of that
I am interested in following up the details, and I would ask that your staff accept, just like Congressman Lucas sends a staff, and your staff knows, oh, we got a letter from Congressman Lucas. Let's respond very quickly here. I'd like to send you a letter today asking for those details.
Thank you. The actual breakdown is a matter of public record. We put it on in our financials each year. I just don't have it memorized.
Well, that's fair. I would not either. Mr. Chairman, we really, I think, would like to, on a bipartisan basis up here, have better interaction with your organization, with you. And I think what you've heard today is another calling on a bipartisan basis for us to do that. We believe if we express our opinion, you should express yours back, not just delay that. I want to thank you for being here, sir, and I will engage you on this matter. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
National Security Subcommittee, Mr. Lukemeyer, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Gensler, my good colleague here, Mr. Cleaver, and I wrote to you in May regarding SEC's Conflicts of Interest Reproposed Rule, number 192, Prohibition Against Conflicts of Interest in Certain Certifications, and our concerns about the potential treatment of mortgage insurance-linked notes. Our letter was filed under the bulk of all comment letters. And the first sentence asked for you to, that we're requesting a clarification of the language that's in your rule. So we're disappointed with the interpretation of our letter, which is pretty plain from the standpoint we'd like to have an answer. But mortgage insurers are a significant source of private capital in the housing and finance system, and these transactions are an important tool to reduce taxpayer risk, exposure, and cost. So question number one, do you agree that federal policy should encourage more private capital in the housing market, especially when it involves well-capitalized and highly rated entities?
Well, I think there are other agencies that are responsible there, but certainly our role at the SEC facilitates a mortgage market. We oversee 11 or $13 trillion mortgage securitization market. And what we are trying to do in that market, like other markets, is drive for greater efficiency and, as you say, opportunity for homeowners.
Well, the question is, can you be a partner with the private sector? In other words, with reinsurance for these companies is very important to be able to allow the reduction, the spread of risk, and then, of course, the reduction of cost. The question is pretty simple. Would you support something like that?
I think that if I understand the question,
that mortgage originators rely also on mortgage insurance. That's an important part of it. That I agree. That's an important part of the market.
Okay. In our letter, we say that the rulemaking may unintentionally prohibit private insurers from procuring reinsurance via the capital markets through these MILs, and which would negatively impact home buyers, lenders, and taxpayers. Are you considering changes to the rule to clarify the treatment of mortgage insurance-linked notes?
Without prejudging any adopting release, we're considering all the comments, including yours, but these individual letters you reference. Congress put a mandate that we had to help ensure that underwriters and sponsors of certain mortgage securitizations not be betting against their investors, and that's what we're trying to do.
Mr. Gensler, the letter should not be canned with the comment letters. It's a request for you to clarify what you're trying to accomplish here, and the letter to point out what we need clarification of. So we'd please appreciate a response. Thank you for that. I also sit on the Chinese Select Committee, and as a result of my position there and the chairmanship of the National Security and Illicit Financing sub-chair here, in 2022, the PCAOB inspection reports of mainland China and Hong Kong accounting firms, which audit U.S.-listed Chinese companies, were scathing and a reminder that financial statements produced by the CCP-controlled companies should never be trusted. Both reports showed unacceptable rates of Part 1-.A deficiencies, which are deficiencies so large that PCAOB staff believe the audit firm failed to obtain sufficient audit evidence to support its work on the public company's financial statements. Essentially, the audits were useless. Is it correct that under the Holding Foreign Companies Act, Accountable Act, these two firms, which fail so spectacularly, will not be inspected again by the PCAOB for another 2 to 3 years?
I'm not familiar enough with the PCAOB's rotating schedule, but it is accurate that when the PCAOB goes in to inspect an auditing firm in any country, they sometimes they don't have the staff to go in on an annual basis.
Well, the premise is correct there, where they only have to do it every 2 or 3 years. And so Mr. Sherman and I have introduced a piece of bipartisan legislation that require them to have an annual audit. These are very, as we saw in 2020, there were 1,000 companies on the exchange. Now it's down between 250 and 300. A lot of them were shell companies, and when we're threatening an audit, suddenly they disappeared. Funneling of our capital to Chinese companies and / the Chinese government and Communist Party has got to stop. And so we would appreciate your support for something like that. And just a quick comment, yes or no?
Look, I think it's really important. If somebody wants to issue stock in the U.S., they need to comply with their laws.
Gentleman's time just
particularly
expired.
China, that's very important.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Himes, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks for joining us today, Mr. Chairman. I want to talk with you for 3 minutes or so about my ongoing efforts to codify insider trading into law, but I do want to take a minute here, since we're on the verge of a government shutdown, to just see how that affects you and your organization. It's sort of taken for granted around here that a shutdown is going to occur because my friends on the other side of the aisle can't find the coherence to pass a rule on the floor, much less do what we know needs to be done to avoid a shutdown, which is to pass a bipartisan continuing resolution. The Senate has figured that out. They're working on that. We'll figure that out eventually. In the meantime, to demonstrate the importance of doing that, we are going to shut down the government because of some MAGA extremists. Now, we get asked all the time about the very visible stuff. We'll be treated in the next couple of weeks to the sight of 19-year-old Marines and sailors lining up at food banks because they don't know that they're getting paid. SBA will be shut down. They will not be able to lend to small businesses, and those small businesses may go under. As we could go on with all the public stuff, but you lead an organization that has an awful lot of people who could be making a lot more money at a bank or at a law firm who are going to be told that they're inessential, who may be furloughed. So let me just give you a minute or so here. I'm curious, even though it's not going to make headlines, what would a shutdown do to morale and capability inside the Securities and Exchange Commission?
It's a remarkable dedicated staff, but we're looking at probably 90 to 93% of our staff would be furloughed. So we'll be down to skeletal
7-8% of our staff. In terms of what it would do for morale, I think that the history shows, because we had one of these in 18 and 35 days at that point in time, that it's hard on people. It's hard because they're not getting a paycheck. It's hard because, as you rightly say, they can get jobs at law firms and elsewhere and go, and they're just really dedicated public servants. In terms of the markets, I would say if a company were deciding to go public or raise offerings, they'd want to go effective before Friday if they're ready to. If not, they might be in a sort of subliminal state where they can't access the markets because we can't effectively review those.
Let me redirect you for a second to, okay, companies raising capital, but your SEC is a whipping boy, you know that. But the truth is, the organization is full of people who are out there prosecuting fraud, who are stopping insider trading. Are we going to see, if there is a meaningful shutdown, fraud go unprosecuted, insider trading? You won't have the capacity to address these things, which hurt the American public, correct?
Yeah. While somebody can still file a tip, complaint, and referral, somebody can file a whistleblower, there won't be the people on the other side to really review it and investigate it.
Thank you. Okay, speaking of insider trading, Mr. Chairman, I want to just briefly discuss with you something I've worked on for 7 years right now, which, as you know, is trying to define insider trading in law. It's not defined in law today, as you know, and as a result, we have court-made law, Newman, Solomon, Martoma, overturning each other, creating a great deal of uncertainty, prosecutions being overturned, convictions being overturned, a great deal of uncertainty. I'm a believer in this idea that if we're going to send somebody for jail, we should be very clear about why we are doing that. So I'd love to get a minute or so from you, Mr. Chairman. Where are we? Would we benefit from a codified statute on insider trading law? Would that remove some of the uncertainty and remove some of the chance that the courts will overturn your traditional activities?
I think that we've had the benefit at the agency of robust, as you said, largely court-made law from the 1980s on, and you referenced some cases even in the last 6-7 years. But I think we've provided you and other members, if I remember, technical assistance on a legislative package that you had last year, if I recall. It almost made it into the NDAA, if I recall, but again, I think that we have good, robust authorities, but the technical assistance, I recall, supported that bill. It supported what you were trying to achieve.
But ideally, and I think you gave us this technical assistance, if we could preserve those authorities that are legacy authorities, if you will, but if we could...
That was the key, that we didn't want to in any way lose the authorities that all the way up to the Supreme Court that we had.
Right. But I see you nodding. If we could codify a definition of insider trading and reduce some of the risk of overturning of case-made law, that might, in the long run, simplify your task and create confidence in the markets. Great.
Yeah, I think and again, we should follow up with staff, but our major concern was that we not somehow undo some of the really good law that's in place.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes herself for 5 minutes. Chair Gensler, while you were a professor at MIT, you spoke at length about how technology could be used to democratize finance. In fact, in a lecture quoted in a podcast entitled Paying It Forward with FinTech with Professor Gary Gensler, you stated, and I quote, "What I was drawn to at MIT was this sense that maybe we can democratize capitalism a bit more, that we can use technology to make finance more inclusive and more accessible to many more millions of people in our country and many more hundreds of millions of people around the globe. Now, sir, as chair of the SEC, you've put forward a predictive data analytics proposal that jeopardizes the innovation and technology that's made investing available to millions more Americans than ever before. I'm confused. At which Gary Gensler, the American public, should believe? The academic version, who spoke glowingly about the power of technology to help more investors participate in U.S. and global capital markets? Or the SEC version, who apparently thinks all use of any technology by broker-dealers and investment advisors is inherently conflicted, and firms should just stop using technology altogether. Chair Gensler, could you please briefly explain this change in your views?
Hello.
Thank you for the question, a clever question. It's
No,
the same Gary Gensler.
I'm
It's
doing
not
a
my
podcast,
identical
but no,
twin brother
kind of,
Rob
so-
or anything. It's
yeah.
me. And I believe technology is so transformative. I think artificial intelligence, machine learning is so transforming this
which one?
decade and so forth. I think robo-advisors and brokerage apps, whether they're using these new technologies or some of the older predictive data analytics, just to stand by the basic concept that the investor is first, not the investment advisor is first. That's all.
We agree there, and this proposal fails to acknowledge the already existing and well-functioning SEC regulations, such as Regulation Best Interest, Reg BI, and the fiduciary standard that protects investors. I would really urge you to withdraw this regulation, as we already have this in place. And during your last appearance in front of this committee, I asked you, sir, if you were planning to rewrite Regulation Best Interest, Reg BI, and you said that it was not currently on your agenda. However, the Commission's proposal on conflicts of interest associated with the use of predictive data analytics effectively rewrites Reg BI by holding broker-dealers and investment advisors to a higher standard of conduct and conflict neutralization than Reg BI. Were you intentionally withholding your plans to supersede Reg BI, sir, with a new proposal when you testified in April?
I feel the same as I did in April. I think this doesn't change Regulation Best Interest or the fiduciary interpretation. This does build on them and an important area around using predictive data analytics. It's if a function, an optimization function, it's a little bit of a math thing, but if the math is basically putting the investment advisor's interest ahead of the investors, if it's making a recommendation or it's giving a nudge, a behavioral nudge to steer somebody somewhere, therein lies a conflict. That's what
it's too broad. I mean, we don't even know what technology would be applied here. And at the core, Reg BI has a fiduciary standard, the best interest, that is already there. You are now superseding that, and it's not just duplicative. It throws out potentially the fiduciary rule in Reg BI. So I again would encourage you, and I think we have bipartisan support to withdraw this rule just as soon as possible. And let me just ask you this question, since I have a limited time. How many staff, because this was a question I sent you that we haven't received response, how many staff with the Division of Trading and Markets and Division Investment Management and the Division of Economic and Risk Analysis were actively involved in drafting the predictive data analytics proposal?
I don't have a number, but I would say that generally speaking.
Do they have advanced degrees in computer science, data science, or engineering, sir?
A number of them have advanced degrees in economics and computer science, but I don't know how many of them do.
Well, I've sent you a list of questions. I'd love to have those answers. This is the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Barr, for 5 minutes.
Chairman Gensler, have you ever spoken to Senator Menendez about the Securities and Exchange Commission's Director of Enforcement, Grilled?
No.
On May 20th, 2021, your public calendar notes a call with Senator Menendez. What was discussed during that call, if you can remember?
2 years ago, sir, but if I recall, there was some discussion about possible disclosure by public companies of political contributions.
Well, you hired Mr. Grilled as the SEC's Director of Enforcement shortly after that May 20th call. Are you aware of the glowing statement in support that was put out by Senator Menendez praising your hire?
I thank you for letting me know that, but until you told me, or until today.
Well, I'm deeply concerned about this, and I'll be following up with your office with additional questions and expect a written response. Mr. Chairman, I really liked your colorful testimony, And you're right, we are blessed with the largest, most sophisticated, most innovative capital markets in the world. But we cannot take this for granted. Even a gold medalist must keep training. With all due respect, Mr. Chairman, if the U.S. capital markets are a gold medalist, you are the Tanya Harding of securities regulation, because you are kneecapping the U.S. capital markets with the avalanche of red tape coming out of your commission. On your climate disclosure rule proposal, you say that the SEC is merit neutral, that your focus on consistency and comparability of disclosures, not the merit of the investment. Sir, that is just not believable. The requiring Scope 3 emissions will lead to wildly inaccurate and immaterial disclosures that will be of little practical use to investors. They would also unfairly and inaccurately portray companies as major polluters that are in reality have very low carbon footprints. Let's be honest, the agenda here is not to provide investors with relevant information, but instead to redirect capital away from fossil energy. Your proposal would discriminate against fossil energy, and you've repeatedly claimed that these disclosures are rooted in investor protection, but the largest U.S. energy exchange traded fund is up 15% over the last 3 months. It's near its highest level in 9 years. How is it protecting investors to deter investment in profitable companies?
This is not doing that, with all respect. All it is about trying to bring some comparability to disclosures being made. We're not a climate agency.
I know. I've heard you say this.
We're really not.
Well, let's be honest. We know what's going on. You're trying to scarlet letter fossil energy.
We're not.
I know you say you're not, but we got the joke. Everybody knows what you're doing. You're trying to redirect capital away. You're trying to discriminate against fossil energy, notwithstanding your protests. Most American investors find all of this Scope 3 emissions nonsense and immaterial. It's immaterial. I know institutional investors talk about this, but this is about an agenda to discriminate against fossil energy, which is profitable. That's not protecting investors. That's hurting investors. It's steering them into less diversified, lower performing funds. Let me move on to the perfect storm of regulations. Let me just move on real quick. Have you consulted with Vice Chair Barr about the Basel III endgame and the interplay between what you're doing on capital markets regulation and what's happening in commercial real estate? I'm very concerned about this because Basel III will increase the cost of credit, diminish lending capacity, and undermine the role that banks play in lending and financial intermediation in commercial real estate. Have you talked to the Fed about how this interacts with conflicts of interest and securitization rule, Rule 15C211, private funds, custody rule, and others? Because I'm really worried that Basel III endgame and all of your regulatory proposals would lead to a death by 1,000 cuts for commercial real estate when we're looking at maturities of $1.5 trillion in commercial real estate over the next 3 years. And it's not just about, refinancing from 3% to now 8%. It's now the fact that Basel III and then all of the non-bank activity is going to be sidelined as a result of the interplay between Basel III and your regulations.
We have ongoing conversation with the Federal Reserve about a number of our roles, but they have the lead on Basel III. That's not something we consult with them on.
All right. Well,
Gentleman's time has expired. I'd ask you to submit the answer for the record.
The interplay in
From Texas, Mr. Williams for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. The SEC's recent climate rule proposal is 500 pages of mandatory disclosures that will now require companies to report on emissions data and climate risk management strategies. This proposal is a major concern for business owners back in my district who are worried. I'm a small business owner also, about the SEC's recent push to implement costly environmental, social, and political regulatory requirements that are not even relevant to the company. So the SEC's proposed climate requirements will cost companies millions of dollars to ensure they are properly compliant with these burdensome rules. This will force business owners to hire more lawyers and compliance officers rather than investing back in their employees and operations, which would help their businesses grow and bring more in revenue. And I've seen that happen in my business. So businesses are already struggling to operate within tight margins, and an increase in compliance costs could be their tipping point. And on top of that, the Scope 3 emissions disclosure will direct companies to speculate on the emissions output of their suppliers and products, which require substantial information in order to get a proper estimate. So this could lead to smaller businesses being left out due to how difficult it is for them to obtain this complex information. And the SEC crusade is extremely out of touch and exceeds their intended missions and statutory authority. So the SEC needs to stop their abuse of the rulemaking process before they cause any further damage to the industry. So, Mr. Chairman, what is the average amount of time and resources everyday companies will need to ensure they are properly compliant with the excessive climate risk disclosures? And how can mandating companies to file on indirect emissions related to their company provide consistent information for investors?
Again, and Mr. Boer sitting behind you asked a similar question. Let me just put it in context, if I may. Investors today are making investment decisions based on climate risk disclosures. We're trying to bring some comparability. You and other members have raised this question about greenhouse gas emissions, so-called Scope 3. And for the listening public, this is of the value chain. It's not about the company itself. It's about their suppliers or their customers. And we got a lot of comment in the public file about this, not just from members of Congress, but from small and medium-sized enterprises in your district and other districts, from farmers and ranchers and the like. We're taking a very close look at this. Our remit, our legal authority is about public companies. It's about the public companies. And over half of the top 1,000 already making disclosures around their emissions. But we understood even in the proposal that so-called Scope 3 is less developed, is less used, and we got a lot of feedback, and we're taking that under consideration and looking at it very closely.
Because when you make small businesses smaller because of regulations,
yeah, and let me assure you, sir, and I've said this in a Senate hearing 2 weeks ago as well, our remit is just about those public companies. It's not the private companies in your district. My dad had a very small company too. That's not the remit of the SEC.
All right. The SEC's rulemaking process is unprecedented, proposing over 50 rulemakings since the spring of 2021. The SEC has failed to understand the impact of these rules and how they will each affect the industry, as well as the aggregate amount or impact. It is crucial that the SEC conduct cost-benefit analysis, solicit industry feedback for these proposals, and what it will cost for the participants that the Commission oversees. I was proud to sign on to a letter led by Chairman McHenry to you, highlighting our concerns with rulemaking agenda and substantial volume. It's vital that the SEC understands the regulatory and financial burdens that they are justly placing on market participants, just like we talked about. So in closing, Chair, has the SEC engaged in any roundtables, field hearings, or investor testing to really solicit feedback before rulemaking?
Again, it was good to read your letter about 8 p.m. last night. It was a good letter. But in terms of your question, we solicit feedback in the formal way through the comment period. We solicit feedback and have hundreds of meetings, sometimes on any one rule, with market participants, and then we detail them in the files, and we benefit from that feedback.
Well, thank you. I yield my time back.
From Minnesota, the whip, Mr. Emmer is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Chair Gensler, I have a series of questions that require a yes or no answer, and in the interest of my limited time, I'd appreciate it if you would comply with it. Mr. Gensler, is it fair to say generally that large institutions in any given industry benefit more from regulatory uncertainty than everyday market participants or smaller institutions who don't have the scale or the capital to fund expensive compliance teams?
Large institutions could benefit from uncertainty.
Reclaiming my time. The answer is yes, sir. Mr. Gensler, you had an 18-year career at Goldman Sachs where you were partner and co-head of finance, correct?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. And is it correct to say that you made most of your personal wealth directly through your employment at this bank, Goldman Sachs?
I've done well since then, too, sir.
I'll take that as a yes as well. You described the SEC under your leadership as the cop on the beat watching out for our constituents, correct?
I think that's a mandate that Congress.
Yeah, and I
has
think
given
you've
us.
said that, reclaiming my time. The answer is yes, sir. If you could just comply with what I've asked, I'd appreciate it. But given your 18-year career at one of the biggest banks in the world and the personal financial fortune you amassed there, do you think it's possible for you to serve as an impartial regulator and not favor large financial intermediaries?
Oh.
Absolutely, sir.
Well, Mr. Gensler, do you believe the vast majority of digital assets meet the investment contract test and are therefore securities operating illegally outside of the U.S. regulatory umbrella?
As I've said, many of these assets are basically the public is anticipating
Sir, is
profits
that a yes?
based on the efforts of others.
Is the answer then yes?
Again, without prejudging anyone, I do think that the significant
Reclaiming my
majority
time,
are
I'll take it as a
investment
yes. And to be
contracts.
clear, sir, this perspective has nothing to do with a concern you noted in a speech last year where you said, quote, "Over the past year, several bank executives have shared their concerns with me about the sheer number of depositors who have moved money from their bank accounts into crypto-related exchanges and wallets," end quote. Right?
The concern that those bank executives raised was that there's
Again, I'm
as
reclaiming my time,
customers
sir.
were getting
No,
hurt.
I've asked you to answer the questions as short as I can so I can use the time I have, and it's clear that you would like to avoid answering the questions, in my opinion. An Obama-appointed judge in the Southern District of New York, a bank-friendly jurisdiction where you bring most of your cases, recently found that decentralized financial technology, quote, "not only removes the so-called middlemen from these transactions, but it also allows users to interact through a variety of methods in an easy and efficient manner," end quote. The court also said underwriters, like the ones at banks where you work, sir, are, quote, precisely the types of individual roles that decentralized exchanges were designed to eliminate, end quote. Mr. Gensler, can you assure this committee that your style of regulation by harassment towards digital asset innovation is to the benefit of every American and not driven by your desires to protect industry incumbents?
Yep.
This is a field that's rife with fraud and manipulation, and I'm looking out for the American investors who've been hurt by the crypto.
Yeah. I'll reclaim my time. Mr. Gensler, despite your years of rhetoric, like today, I'm convinced you are not an impartial regulator. Instead, it's clear that you are working to consolidate your own power, even though it means crushing opportunities for everyday Americans and, frankly, the financial future of this country. Even the federal courts are highlighting the damage you, sir, are doing to our constituents, and they're telling you that you don't have the legal authority to accomplish your goal of squashing competition in the financial markets. Congress has been telling you that too. Now, Mr. Gensler, I believe our great financial system is the definition of freedom in this country. And congressional policies must provide room for the traditional financial system to evolve alongside the disruptive digital asset ecosystem. That said, it cannot be understated that a common theme throughout your career, sir, is your relentless loyalty to the largest financial institutions at the clear expense of innovation, competition, and everyday Americans. I yield back.
I suspect some large financial institutions would not agree with that.
There's no question, sir. I've yielded back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Gottheimer, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Gensler, Shana Tova. It's good to see you.
Shana Tova, may this year bring you health and happiness.
You too, sir. If I can begin, in your testimony, you said that it generally takes 12 to 24 months for the SEC to proceed from issuing a new rule proposal to adopting it as a final rule. That may seem like a long time, but I assure you, as it's not a very long time for some of the smaller stakeholders that I speak to, but who are spending so much of their time and resources and running their business and trying to compete. And of course, I'm getting concerned, and I wanted to get your thoughts on this as well. Are you worried at all that all these rules are putting smaller and medium-sized businesses at a disadvantage and inadvertently benefiting the larger ones that can better handle the deluge of all the proposals? So is there an unintended consequence of actually limiting the flow of capital to smaller and medium-sized businesses and favoring the larger ones?
Look, and we've talked about this in your office as well. I think that we benefit hearing from those small businesses. We often then look to adjust the rules based on those comments, and also if the rule is adopted, the implementation and compliance dates. And sometimes we stage that, whether it's over 12 to 24 months and the like, after a rule is adopted.
Part of my concern is, and I appreciate our ongoing discussion on this front. By my count, you've issued 50 separate rules, and there are another 14 new rules on your most recent unified agenda that are scheduled to propose in the coming months. And I'm just trying to figure out the volume, what this means for the smaller stakeholders, and they just don't have the back end, the regulatory back end to be able to engage with the SEC and don't know how to engage with the SEC in some ways. How do you think about that? How are you trying to shape the agency to really allow for them to also have a fair shot at comment period?
Well, in part by putting out the agenda itself 2.5 years ago, we've now proposed the bulk of that. And then working through, we take meetings even after comment periods, all the way up to sometimes a few weeks before we adopt. And so to keep engaging with us. And certainly if there's, not a shutdown, we're here. We're ready to take those meetings.
Yeah, just sometimes just so you should know, just some feedback that they often feel they don't know how to come into the agency, how to utilize the agency, that it can be intimidating. Especially if you're a smaller player, you just don't know really how to do it, and they don't have these big regulatory teams.
I would say that sometimes those are the best meetings. They're not necessarily the meetings that show up on the calendar as much, but they really are very helpful to hear from those smaller asset managers, those smaller broker-dealers, or public companies.
I'd like to shift gears to digital assets. In July, I was proud this committee passed comprehensive digital asset legislation, bipartisan, including my amendment directing the SEC and CFTC to do a joint rulemaking, creating a process for delisting an asset. Since 2019, I've said that clear rules of the road for digital asset firms are critical to protect consumers and promote innovation here in the United States. You've claimed that you have all the authority you need, I know before us, but a rulemaking process hasn't started yet. Can you explain to us why?
Mm-hmm.
Well, because there's already laws and rules in the books. There's rules and laws in the book that apply to crypto security tokens like they apply to others. And there's nothing incompatible because you're storing something of value on a blockchain ledger. We talked earlier about being technology neutral. Whether you're storing that at DTCC, the public clearinghouse, or you're storing it on an accounting ledger called blockchain, it's still a transfer of value, and the public is maybe, depending on the token, anticipating a profit based on the efforts of others. As it relates to the so-called crypto exchanges, they're doing what we wouldn't even allow anywhere else. They're commingling, co-bundling, trading against the public, and sometimes front-running the public on their platforms.
So memorandums of understanding have long been used and adopted in a number of contexts. In June 2022, you told the Financial Times you were working on an MOU with the CFTC to avoid regulatory gaps for crypto. Can you give us an update on the status of the MOU, please?
I was hopeful that we would do something there, but what we do is on a case-by-case basis and issue-by-issue basis work with the Commodity Futures Trading Commission with regard to this crypto field. They have important authorities. They execute against those authorities. We do against our authorities, really both with the same goal of protecting the public.
Thank you, man. Have a sweet new year. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Huizinga, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good to be back. I was out of order here because I was in a bipartisan meeting with the Speaker talking about a debt commission, and I hope that is going to be part of the path forward that we are dealing with government funding and our long-term debt. But I want to move quickly, but I want to follow up on some of Chairman McHenry's line of questions and remarks. And I'm not going to belabor the whole situation where we've had public documents that you've given us on our request that's been out there for over 7 months. No real information except for that which was FOIA'd by the public. Our request simply seeks to obtain information to better understand the black box of the SEC's activities on climate-related measures and its rulemaking authority. And you had said in your own remarks, quote, based on authorities granted by Congress. Well, I dispute the assertion that you've been granted that authority in this particular case, and we are a co-equal branch of government, and this is routine congressional oversight. So let's talk a little bit about the commission vote for the climate request. When Chair McHenry asked, have you scheduled a vote for the commission? I did not hear an answer on that. Or when will a vote be scheduled? I did not hear an answer on that. There's 13,000 emails and documents we've been told that are ready to be produced, but are being held up by a provision within the Exchange Commission, 24C, Exchange Act, sorry, I should say. It requires a vote of the SEC commissioners, is your assertion, or the commission's assertion. Lawyers differ on that, and it's my understanding that you claim that you don't have the votes necessary on the commission. But Mr. Gensler, I want to ask you this. Are you personally ready to vote yes to produce these documents to this committee?
We continue to work with your staff and continue to work. We have voted as a commission on the, I think they're called transcribed interviews of.
This transcribed interviews are very different than the documents that we have requested. I'm asking you, not about the commission. Are you voting yes, and will you vote yes on giving that information to our committee as requested?
Again, as I've said, I truly believe in the oversight of this committee.
Yes.
Working with the committee to
yes or no?
Working with my fellow commissioners, and
I want to know what you are going to do, not speaking for anybody else. You.
Again.
Yes or no?
Sir, again, we're working through this at the commission level and with.
All right, this is ridiculous. Okay, so let's assume your answer now is no. So what have you done to try to produce a vote of any sort? Are you talking to your fellow commissioners? Are you whipping them? Are you asking them to vote for that?
We have ongoing discussions. We, of course, have to have it one-on-one because of the Government and Sunshine Act.
All right. Frankly, we've been pretty cloudy over here on the congressional side. I mean, you're fulfilling FOIA requests, but you will not give that same information to Congress. That's a problem. So under 24C, the delegated authority by the commission allows you to do those FOIA requests without a vote of the commission. Seems to me maybe we need to help you out. Does that seem reasonable? Because here's our problem. What happens if you never get the votes? What's your plan? Ignore Congress?
We're going to continue to working with you.
What is your plan? Because we've got a plan. The chairman outlined the plan. And it begins with a P and ends in oxy, and it's not a real fun word that any of us want to fulfill.
Again, we're continuing to work and trying to get you documents on a regular basis.
But you are not. You are giving us publicly available documents. That is not the role of oversight. It's okay. So are you open to legislation that would clarify that the SEC is not required to have a full commission vote to comply with the requests for Congress or in Congress or this committee?
Again, I'd have to have staff look at the legislation. We'd give technical assistance as we give it on other provisions.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure we don't need your technical assistance because so far the technical assistance has gotten us nothing. So, I enthusiastically support the chair's discussion of using compulsory process. And it's shameful that you're hiding behind this 24C process and that the commission is. And we are going to have to remedy that, apparently, based on your lack of cooperation. One last quick question. Did you ever receive a memorandum or agency document in writing assessing the Supreme Court's decision on West Virginia versus EPA on the SEC's rulemaking authority?
I know that we've had discussions. I don't remember any memo. I've read.
I'm going to ask you to follow up. My time has expired.
Gentleman's time has expired.
We're going to have you follow up in writing with that, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you.
Gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Caston, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Nice to see you again, Secretary. I want to talk about your climate disclosure rule. I know that surprises you that I want to talk about that. And I realize that with it coming out soon, I'm not going to be able to get into specifics, but I do just want to expand a little bit. You had mentioned to Mr. Cleaver that investors were asking for more clarity because of all the voluntary disclosures that are out there. And I think, but I don't want to be presumptuous, that there's some history there that I'm hoping you can share, because I think in 2010, SEC drafted sort of interpretive guidance regarding more voluntary disclosures. Can you clarify what happened between 2010 and then 12 years later in March of 22 when the SEC decided that it was necessary to provide some more disclosure, and specifically if you can comment, like, what was industry asking you for?
So a lot changed in the 12 years, particularly investors got more and more interested making investment decisions. And here in the U.S., companies responded their investor relations and their CFOs and corporate executives responded to meet those requests by investors. And they started following something that was called the TCFD framework. You're probably familiar with this international framework, which interestingly was 32 people that were mostly from industry. They weren't government sector that came to this framework. And so by 2021, 80+% of the top 1,000 companies were making some climate risk disclosures. That's what really changed. Investor demand for investor decision-making, and that's where the SEC has a role.
Well, I appreciate that. That certainly is consistent with my experience in the private sector, and I think it said that we need to keep reminding folks that this was a industry-led initiative in the first instance. I want to move to the state level because a little while ago you had mentioned to the Wall Street Journal that if California finalized some rules, I think your quote was, you said, this may change some of the economic baseline of the commission as it relates to the pending order. And of course, last month, the California legislature did pass a package of climate disclosure bills, which I understand only relates to companies beyond a certain size that do business in California. But given your earlier comments, can you speak to how, if at all, that is factoring into how you're thinking about the disclosure and whether you're still on pace for an October release, as you'd earlier indicated?
So in terms of, we look at the economics very seriously, and that law that was passed in California is not yet signed, but if it were signed into law, as I understand it, that would require companies of a certain size to report on their climate risk, I think over $500 million in revenues, and those over $1 billion in revenues to report greenhouse gas emissions. And for the listening public—
And on a Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 basis, it's
yeah,
pointing
all
out.
three of these scopes. But for the listening public, it's estimated that somewhere between 1,400 and 1,500 public companies might need to report under that law. We have not confirmed that number. That's just an estimate that's in the press. And so that may change the baseline. If those companies were reporting to California, then it would be in essence less costly then because they've already been producing that information. It's also important that the investing public, again, because they're making decisions based on those public reports, that they're accurate, that they're truthful, because the investing public benefits making sure that the accuracy of the disclosures.
And you had indicated that you were targeting an October release date for the final rule. Are you still on that pace? Can you speak that? And does California's actions in any way change that?
Let me just put this a little in context. Twice a year, working with the Office of Management and Budget, we put out what's called a unified agenda. And we put dates on all of the proposals really in 2 different dates of the year. So I wouldn't, with all respect, put too much emphasis on that. It's really with 16,000 comments. We've gone through what's 15, 16 months since we made the proposal. It tends to take, again, 12 to 24 months. But we're not doing this against a clock. When the staff's ready, when the commission's ready.
Well, thank you. Got more questions, but I'm out of time, so I yield back. Thank you again for being here.
Gentleman yields back. We'll now go to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Loudermilk, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Gensler, thank you for being here. Mr. Chairman, without objection, I'd like to submit for the record a Wall Street Journal article by Warren Stevens and Paul Riley entitled, "The SEC Wants to Spy on Your Portfolio."
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Gensler, as the op-ed points out, prior to the consolidated audit trail, the government needed legal cause to force financial institutions to report their customers' personally identifiable information. In your opening statement, you refer to the SEC as cop on the beat. But law enforcement has to comply with due process. And I'm convinced that the consolidated audit trail has the potential to become another warrantless surveillance program. And as we have all experienced, if you extend the government power, that power will inevitably be abused, as we saw with the FISA courts, especially
if that power does not have direct oversight and control by Congress? My first question, Ms. Gensler, have you read this article? The Wall Street Journal just came out the other day about the consolidated audit trail.
I may have, I feel like it's in the last 2 days. I saw the headlines.
All right. So it goes on to explain the problems that I've laid out several times when you've been here before about the collecting of personal identifiable information and, quite frankly, a lot of information about individuals and their buying of stock. In fact, when you were here last time, I believe that you expressed the purpose of this is so you could peruse to look for any potential illegal activity. That's a blatant violation of the Fourth Amendment. That is what this article is spelling out. And it's gotten the attention of a lot of people, even outside the financial services arena. So I would encourage you to please read it because I think it explains the concerns that many of us have about this program. Also, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit for the record a letter that was sent by me and my colleagues to Mr. Gensler regarding the Consolidated Act audit trail.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Gensler, regarding this letter, in the letter I ask about the 3,000 individuals, estimated number of people or institutions that would have access to the Consolidated Audit Trail or the Customer Account Information System. 3,000 would have access to it. Who are these individuals and how will they be vetted for access to such sensitive information?
One, I do look forward. I will read the article that you mentioned. Two, in terms of individuals, it's only allowed to be used, this Consolidated Audit Trail, at the SEC and the self-regulatory organizations. At the SEC, it's our Division of Enforcement, our economic risk analysis, folks in our trading and markets.
How are they going to be, how are all these, 3,000 individuals getting access to personally identifiable information and details about stock transactions by even just a factory worker who has a Robinhood account? What's the vetting process on this? And how are we going to be ensured that they do not use this in violation of personal rights?
I just want to say I'm not familiar with that number, but in terms of at the SEC, these are people that are dedicated public servants that are full-time at the agency, either in our enforcement, our economic risk, our trading and markets, the market surveillance.
Well, if you respond to the letter, that may be helpful. And I'd like to move on because we are getting short on time. This really just a yes or no question. Will the SEC use data collected via the Consolidated Audit Trail and the Customer Account Information System to bring enforcement actions?
We have already. We will anticipate in the future.
So let me make sure I've got this right. Well, let me ask you this. How has it been funded, the Consolidated Audit Trail? Is this being appropriated by Congress?
It's by industry funding.
Okay, so private industry is funding this, which the cost of this has gone up exponentially since it started. But this, just to close out, I want to make sure I understand. You're saying that the Consolidated Audit Trail is a comprehensive database of transactions used for federal enforcement purposes, but it is not subject to congressional oversight or through appropriations. I mean, this is lining up to be another surveillance program without any control, without any constraint, without even the power of the purse. And I yield back.
Almost time has expired. We'll now go to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Torres, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Gensler, good morning. I worry that the term investment contract has become so infinitely malleable and manipulable that it means whatever you unilaterally thinks it ought to mean, right? I worry that when it comes to crypto, your interpretation of the term investment contract has no limiting principle and therefore could invite arbitrary and capricious enforcement action. So I want to take a few minutes to explore the concept of investment contract in greater depth. And I want to start with an obvious definitional question. We know that an investment contract requires an investment. Does an investment contract require a contract?
Something about this definition, I will quote Thurgood Marshall, Congress painted with a broad brush. When Marshall said that, he was writing the law of the land. So we follow this Howey test and how not just Marshall, but other courts interpreted it. and it has a four components.
I did not go to MIT, but in the Bronx, if I ask whether an investment contract includes a contract, the answer is typically yes or no. So,
Well, actually, sir, under the Supreme Court law of the land, they do not write that in. They say it's an investment of money in a common enterprise. And you're anticipating profits based on the efforts of others. So, I took an oath to follow the law of the land, and that's the Supreme Court law of the land.
So in Howey, the Supreme Court refers to an investment contract as a contract, scheme, or transaction. That was the terminology that I saw in the case. And as far as I can tell, there's nothing in the Supreme Court's jurisprudence that suggests that a scheme or transaction means the absence of a contract. And so by way of illustration, consider the landmark case of SEC versus Howey. In the Howey case, there was not a single contract, but there were two contracts. A land sales contract with the Howey Company and a service contract with Howey in the Hills. And the court found that the combination of those two contracts, the total scheme, the total transaction, the total economic reality, was constitutive of an investment contract. And so a scheme or a transaction does not mean the absence of any contract at all. It means, as it did in Howey, a multiplicity of contracts. In August, there were 6 law professors from law schools as preeminent as Yale who came to the following conclusion, quote, "No decision of the Supreme Court has ever found that a scheme that does not involve a contract could qualify as an investment contract." And so do you disagree with that statement? And if so, could you please cite a decision of the Supreme Court that has found an investment contract in the absence of an actual contract?
The SEC has been in front of multiple courts, and investment contract has been...
What's the name of the case, Mr. Gensler? The Supreme Court case that has found an investment contract in the absence of an actual contract. Do you have the name? Can you cite a case?
The SEC over the decades, whether it's...
Can you cite a case?
Whether it's whiskey caskets, whether it's crypto, if the public is investing based upon the efforts of others...
I find it telling that you cannot cite a single case.
That's a security.
Not a single... How about a Second Circuit case? Can you cite a single Second Circuit case that found an investment contract in the absence of a contract?
I understand where you're trying to go, and I'm going to leave that to the very fine attorneys at the SEC in front of courts. But I'm saying the core principle...
Mr. Gensler,
this is a field...
This is. Let me finish. This is a question to which you should know the answer, because the definition of an investment contract is the central issue. That's what determines the extent of your authority. That's what determines the applicability of federal securities law to crypto transactions. And your inability to answer that question is baffling to me.
I'm answering it consistent with what the Supreme Court has said, which is the law of the land is a 4-part test.
And yet you cannot cite a single case to support your argument.
Howey, it's called Reeves, it's called many cases at the Supreme Court, sir. 8 or 9 times it's been affirmed by the Supreme Court.
Can I ask, suppose I were to purchase a Pokemon card. Would doing so constitute a security transaction?
You could purchase a Pokemon card. I don't know what the context is, but if you're just purchasing a Pokemon card...
If I purchase a Pokemon card, is that a security transaction?
That's not a security.
Okay. If I were to purchase a tokenized Pokemon card on a digital exchange via a blockchain, is that a security transaction?
I'd have to know more.
Okay, so for you, the process of tokenization is what transforms a non-security transaction into a security transaction?
Look, if the investing...
I thought you were technology neutral.
If the investing public is anticipating profits based upon the efforts of others and they're exchanging funds, that's the core...
I see my time has expired, so...
Gentleman's time has expired. Well, I'll go to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Davidson, for 5 minutes.
Chairman Gensler, recently a federal court called your rejection of a Bitcoin ETF, quote, arbitrary and capricious. In a subsequent interview, you dismissed the judge's opinion. Asked a follow-up question, if anything a judge says would change your mind, you responded, quote, well, no, not really. It seems that you don't really recognize the authority of the judicial branch. You seem to have a love for the Howey test, selectively applied as illustrated by Mr. Torres. But, in light of those reactions, what should people make about the Bitcoin ETF? How will the SEC revise its approach?
We have great respect for the courts. I personally have great respect for the courts. We're considering that. It's still an active consideration at the commission. And
so you haven't made up your
familiar,
mind. I got to tell you,
familiar with the case.
Yeah, I got to tell you that many market participants have reached out and are concerned that you will arbitrarily, perhaps also capriciously, pull recent filings ahead of others who've been working with the SEC for years to get an approval for a Bitcoin spot ETF. Will this resemble some sort of free pass for one favored company while others remain locked out? And I ask that because it seems that's happened before at the SEC.
Sir, I'm not sure if I'm following. I mean, we're still considering that court case and the application, as you say, to Bitcoin exchange-traded products.
Are you going to preserve people's place in line, or are you going to pull ahead a favored transaction or another on the consideration of a Bitcoin spot ETF? Are you going to preserve the place in the queue? Because timing matters. People have worked on this for years, and then you get a recent filing by somebody big in the market, and it seems like, oh, yeah, let me take your calls. How can I help? Meanwhile, you've given the stiff arm, as I've said, Hotel California style regulations where you can check in with the SEC, but you can never leave with clarity. And how about the legislative branch? Do you recognize the authority of Congress or the laws that we pass?
Yes, we comply with the laws that Congress passes every day.
Well, I've heard you say that about the courts and now Congress, which is encouraging, but I am inclined to judge your deeds more than your words. And, I'll pick up where one of my colleagues, Mr. Huizinga, left off with the Supreme Court decision in West Virginia versus the EPA. Are you familiar with that case?
Yes, sir, I'm familiar. It's an important case.
Glad to hear you say that. And it would be binding, correct?
It's the law of the land, sir.
That's right. And it introduces a major questions doctrine. And you told Mr. Barr that you received tons of feedback on your proposed ESG disclosure rules, feedback that should make clear that the proposal for ESG disclosure is a major question. And it should make clear that you don't have the legal authority to do that. So I'd ask you to knock it off. Cease and desist and work with this body to pass a law if you want to regulate something. Frankly, your time as chairman has highlighted two problems, a Gary Gensler problem and a structural flaw in the SEC. And as I told you in April, I proposed a solution called the SEC Stabilization Act. You're making the case for this bill easier every day you are acting as the chairman by doing rulemaking after rulemaking without any regard to the impact of these rules, or maybe that's the feature for you, I don't know. But it's having a massive impact on our markets. I mean, we have markets that truly are the envy of the world, and why would you disrupt them, with processes that are driving capital out of our markets? Not because to avoid our laws, but to find some place where they can get clarity, where they can work with a regulator and get a decision and a path forward. So instead of selectively applied, you are you're not providing clarity with a rule that's evenly applied. You're intentionally shortening comment periods to limit feedback. And the courts have even called this arbitrary and capricious. You're pushing a woke political and social agenda, and I think abusing your role and the authority of the SEC as cover. So, I think fundamentally, the SEC Stabilization Act would remove the role of chairman. It would preserve the current commissioners. It would add a sixth commissioner. So there would be no more than 3 from any one political party. And so that would provide a path that would make the SEC do what you're avoiding. Frankly, you're front-running Congress, you're front-running the courts, you're front-running even the own administration, and no one has held you to account for that. I mean, I wish the Biden administration would say you're fired, but the list of folks they need to do that for is long. Congress hopefully will with the SEC Stabilization Act. I yield.
Gentleman's time's expired. We'll now recognize the gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Horsford, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and to the ranking member for the hearing, to Chair Gensler for being here. While investor protection remains paramount for my colleagues and myself, it should not be lost on anyone here that the largest risk our investing public is exposed to at this moment is the risk of a government shutdown. We hear time and again in this committee that our capital markets are the deepest and most efficient in the world. And yet, a large part of why they were able to reach their presently enjoyed eminent status is because investors around the globe have confidence that the SEC has the power necessary to maintain fair and orderly markets. Without proper funding in place, the SEC cannot carry out that critical investor protection mandate, and I fear that as funding disruptions become increasingly more common, we risk losing the world's confidence. And so I'll continue working earnestly with my colleagues to avoid a counterproductive MAGA Republican inflicted government shutdown, but I ask all of my colleagues to consider the far-reaching consequences of this short-sighted path. Mr. Chairman Gensler, when we last spoke, I raised concerns regarding the open-end fund liquidity rule, and I appreciated your willingness to consider that the vast majority of my constituents do the bulk of their investing through their retirement plans. These hardworking Nevadans should not be at risk of losing out on today's price simply because they live on the West Coast. Chairman Gensler, as the SEC continues to evaluate its economic analysis for the open-end fund liquidity proposal, what have you been able to ascertain about the disparate impact for investors based on geographic location?
It's been raised by yourself, but it's been raised by members of the public.
Have you resolved it in the rule? And I only have 3 minutes.
I appreciate it. I'm not trying to prejudge where we will end up. The overall rule had 3 key parts. You're focused on one, which is what was called the close, or hard close. But there are 2 other really important parts. Liquidity, just what is the liquidity behind?
So will the geographic location be factored in your final rule, yes or no?
It's an aspect of it, but it's still all funds today close at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time,
which
so
disproportionately impacts Nevadans and people on the West Coast. So I'm going to keep pressing the issue until you understand that it's a disparate impact on those of us who live on the West Coast. And Nevadans should not be treated unfairly because of where they live. That needs to be factored in the final rule.
I agree,
Chairman Gensler, as Mr. Meeks pointed out earlier, minority and women-owned firms still tend to be smaller as they work to overcome their traditional underinvestment and lack of working capital. As you heard previously, these smaller, more diverse firms will have more difficulty complying with the new disclosures required and will have less ability to absorb the cost associated with doing so. Earlier, you had begun discussing the expanded analysis the SEC made for the disproportionate impact on diverse and women-owned funds when the Commission considered the private fund advisor rule. Would you be able to expand upon your earlier answer that these funds were included in the analysis of small business and give us any specifics that your team found on the potential impacts on these funds?
I'd be happy to have staff follow up with the actual pages and the parts of the economic analysis, but it was considered as part of the effects on small investment advisors, including women and firms of minority-held firms.
It is a waning diversity. The issue of waning diversity in our equity markets is of great concern, and we must be careful about adding any additional burdens on these small firms. And I look forward to working with the SEC specifically on this issue. As I said, it's a wider issue, Mr. Chairman, and I worry that at a time when attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, not woke, like my colleague just referred to, when the next time someone uses that word, will you define what you mean by it? Because to me, it means anti-diversity. It means anti-inclusion. And if that's what you stand for, then you don't represent me or my constituents. We are working hard to hold the line. There is nothing in any court decision by the Supreme Court or anywhere else that should squelch private sector's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. We must use every tool available to us to not only bring new entrants into the financial system, but to also promote their success within our financial institutions as well. I will yield back at this time.
Gentleman yields. The gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Rose, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and thank you, Chair Gensler, for taking time to leave your virtual office in Maryland to attend today's meeting. And I was also glad to see that you held an in-person open meeting last week for, I think, the first time during your chairmanship. I say that because, Chair Gensler, you are rarely in the office and conduct most of your meetings from the comfort of your home. And what I wonder is, how can we be sure of who you are meeting with on a daily basis? If perhaps someone from Better Markets comes over for dinner to discuss Europeanizing our U.S. capital markets, would that be logged and made publicly available on your calendar?
I haven't had any of those dinners, but hypothetically, if I had that dinner, it would be logged.
I hope so, and I'm glad to hear that. Chair Gensler, in your written testimony, you state that, quote, we also have finalized 24 rulemakings, nearly all of which have changed based on public feedback, close quote. Approximately how many hours per week do you personally spend reading public comments submitted to the unprecedented number of proposed rulemakings issued by the SEC?
I work a lot of hours during the week. My kids are grown and out of the house. My girlfriend lives in a different city. So I don't know how it breaks out. I usually get summaries of the comments, but then staff gives me individual. If it's a member of Congress, I read all of the members of Congress comments personally. But then I get examples in each of the rulemakings, a handful on each of the issues.
Well, I'm glad to hear that as well. Chair Gensler, in May, I co-led a bipartisan letter to you along with my colleague Jennifer Wexton and 22 of our colleagues regarding troubling accusations that the China-backed fast fashion retailer Shein allegedly engages in human rights violations, including utilizing materials that may have been made using Uyghur forced labor. Do you believe that Shein should be required to certify via independent verification that the company does not use Uyghur forced labor as a condition of being registered to issue securities in the United States?
If I might step away from one registrant and go a little broader, Congress passed a law, the Uyghur Forced Labor Act, I think was the name, and that's the law of the land. And so if you're a registrant and you're getting supplies from that region of China, whether you're a U.S. company or a China-based company, we put out guidance, the staff put out guidance earlier this year to all public registrants that they have to speak to if they're in compliance with that act of Congress. Again, materiality matters, and we've been very clear with that with individual registrants and their filings, and our Division of Corporation Finance makes that abundantly clear in each of those registrants' discussions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask unanimous consent to have the text of that letter entered into the record.
Without objection.
Chair Gensler, regarding cryptocurrencies and shifting gears, I'm interested in why you have pursued a litigation-heavy strategy, despite the fact that neither you nor any of your senior staff are litigators, neither your chief of staff nor your policy director or even your general counsel. Why have you settled on such a litigation-heavy strategy to address the cryptocurrency market?
Frankly, it's because the field is so rife with hucksters and fraudsters and non-compliant parties, but we've also done rulemaking, one related to broker-dealers that was completed a number of years ago, and then others related to the definition of exchange and the custody rule that's been discussed a bit here, and even something called best execution. But this is a field where the American public's at risk and being harmed every day on these platforms that are commingling and trading, often trading against their customers.
Well, in my view, it seems that these cases are brought with an explicit political agenda, not a substantive legal one.
Nothing could be furthest from the truth. There's nothing, the only thing political is protecting the American public, which I think members on both sides of the aisle probably agree. They don't want to see constituents hurt. And in a place where a lot of crypto projects are not properly disclosing. There's been all too many bankruptcies, and in the bankruptcies, investors are just lining up at the bankruptcy court.
Well, thank you. In my opinion, I'd like to see you do more from the regulatory and guidance side because this industry is so important and we need to foster it, in my view. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Tlaib, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Gensler, for being here. I know that you've been pretty public about the fact that or maybe you made an argument or took a position that it's too costly for firms if the SEC establish a robust climate disclosure rule. Is that correct?
There are many comments in our comment file that have raised that, and that's what I'm talking about, because we, under the Administrative Procedure Act, have to take all those comments and do an economic analysis that takes into consideration the cost.
So in those comments, I mean, one of the things is suggested, I mean, this is despite, I think, about 1,000 companies have already voluntarily reported emissions from their customers and suppliers. We call it Scope 3 emissions, as you know, where most of the firm's greenhouse gas emissions can originate. So on top of that, we also are now seeing thousands of additional U.S. companies will soon be required to report Scope 3 emissions to comply with the EU standards. And then California, I think, just passed a bill that would require roughly 5,000 public and private companies to report Scope 3 emissions, correct?
Yes, I believe both Europe and if the governor signs the law in California, that will be the case. And it will change the economics because it, in essence, changes the baseline.
So do you think you're going to look at that? And because those three, you know, just looking at those moves by California, of course, and the EU, Scope 3 emission disclosures, would it undermine, I think, the argument that such reporting would be overly burdensome to be required by SEC?
While it may change the economics over the course of the years, California's rule wouldn't be in place till 2027, I believe. It's still we, the SEC, have to stay within our remit and the laws as Congress has passed, and it's about investor decisions and what they're being disclosed.
Sure. So if I may, Chair, I would like to submit for the record a letter signed by 25 of my colleagues, House and Senate, urging you, Chair Gensler, to finalize a robust climate disclosure rule that includes Scope 3 emissions.
Without objection.
You know, it's pretty simple why we need a robust disclosure rule, Chair. I mean, it's simple maybe for me. I know this is what you do every day, but I think the impact on the ground for my families is pretty clear. I mean, currently U.S. companies can and do obscure their exposure to climate risks, as you probably already know, and threaten the investments that retirees and workers depend on. So, for example, like you look at Brookfield Renewable, an affiliate of a giant asset manager, and Brookfield describes itself as, this is quote, one of the world's largest publicly traded pure play renewable power platforms. Sounds like a choice that would avoid climate-related financial risks, right? Wrong. A recent report found that Brookfield Renewable is invested in a fund that holds fossil fuel infrastructure assets, including Alberta oil sands pipelines, which the firm does not disclose in its SEC filings. This is just one example among many, Chair, of financial greenwashing, which regularly involves omission of Scope 3 emissions. So again, I really think such practices jeopardize the hard-earned life savings of many of my residents and workers across our country, retirees that invest paycheck after paycheck, year after year, to secure their financial future. So just please know, and I want to be on record, that I really would urge you to move forward on having a robust disclosure firm. But with that, Mr. Chair, I would like to yield the rest of my time to Member Foster.
Thank you. I just have one quick question. I take it that you're familiar with this graphic from Bloomberg that shows you lagging significantly behind your three predecessors in terms of the number of rules you finalized in the first 2 years of your tenure?
I did read that in Bloomberg Law 2 weeks ago.
Okay, now when your Republican predecessor, Harvey Pitt, finalized 34 rules in his first 2 years and 4 months, I guess, was that preceded by the sort of detailed cost benefit of all the possible interplays between all of these rules that our Republican colleagues are asking for?
It included cost benefit, but we benefit from.
But the interplay between the 34 rules, which now is apparent.
I thank you. As best I understand, they did it rule by rule individually.
Individually, yeah. And so when Mary Shapiro did 28, or under Trump, Jay Clayton did 25 rules in the first 2 years, was there any, comprehensive analysis of the interplay that's now being demanded?
Again, we're following.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Timmons, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chair Gensler, thank you for being here today.
It's good to see you again.
Yes, sir. The SEC's onslaught of rulemaking, I think, is severely impeding U.S. markets in the name of protecting investors from themselves. Your regulatory approach is an insult to the intelligent Americans and their ability to make risk-based decisions when investing. Quite frankly, we've never seen market participation at the levels we see today. The current ecosystem represents a thriving financial sector where people, no matter their income levels, have access to investment opportunities previously unseen in human history. And this is why I struggle to rationalize why the SEC continues down this warpath of rushed and quickly written proposed rules. I could go down the list and probably name dozens of proposals that I think are too broad and they lack quantitative analysis or have reduced comment periods, but I'm just going to talk about a couple of them. So on December 14th of 2022, the SEC released 4 proposals that would overhaul the regulations governing equity markets. These proposals make sweeping changes to how national market system stock orders are priced, executed, and reported. This is despite the fact that there is no indication of a market failure that would warrant such a sweeping overhaul of the U.S. equity markets. Traditionally, regulatory agencies introduce new regulations in response to market failures or when directed by Congress. Regulators tailor solutions to address the specific problems identified. However, with these proposals, there's no clear need for change in the market, nor has Congress mandated such sweeping reforms. The SEC cites the October 2021 SEC staff report on meme stocks as a rationale for the proposed rulemaking. However, the report does not recommend any equity market structure reforms. To this point, you have repeated this buzz phrase, the playing field isn't level. But you haven't explained what that means or cited how it harms investors. Investors have the best user experience and the lowest costs in history. The industry says you're just picking favorites between exchanges versus wholesalers and that retail investors may not actually benefit from these proposals. So that was my long intro. How concerned should we be about the potential for increased costs to investors, especially in scenarios where retail brokers may need to reinstate commissions due to changes like the suggested increase in price improvement?
The proposals were put out to address individual problems, but they really are about driving greater competition and efficiency. Right now, our equity markets on any given day, depends on the stock, between 30 and 50% is not in the lit markets, it's being traded in what's called the dark markets. And so we're trying to bring more competition in that. One of the rules actually has a tremendous amount of support in the comment file from many market participants is about lowering the minimum increment you can trade at, a penny down to a half a penny, for instance, and things like that. So we're looking at these comments and we're looking through to update our rules.
So currently, tens of thousands of Americans can trade for free and at their fingertips. Do you think that your proposal will result in the reintroduction of commissions?
Zero commission does not mean it's necessarily for free. There's a lot of things that are going on behind. When you send a market order, that's a very sweet order because most investors doing 100 shares are not going to invest another 100 shares or another 10,000 shares behind it.
It's going to result in increased fees for the people that currently have no fees. But
actually, what our economic analysis shows that in each of these roles it would benefit. We believe that the benefits are significant.
Sorry, so you're saying that if this rule goes into effect, that the people that are currently trading for free will not have to pay commissions? Because I think they will have to, because that's how the market's going to inevitably function. You're not going to be able to continue providing free trades if this rule goes into effect.
Actually, again, there's separate rules, but the one I was talking about is in terms of lowering the minimum increment. There's a lot of support for the other rules as well to say that brokers have to give their clients best execution seems pretty straightforward to many of us.
I just think that if we're going to try to provide inclusion and participation in the markets for all Americans, we need to do this with a scalpel and not a sledgehammer. And I think you've been taking a sledgehammer during your time at the SEC. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Right, I'm going to end this one there, guys. I'm going to put a link in the description, yeah, because this is way too long now and I'm getting a little bit bored. Sorry about that, but, you know, people need to pay attention to what's happening with Gary Gensler in particular. He's likely to get a grilling, more so further on. If you go, I believe there's more senators, more members coming up and having a go at him. But I've got to go out, unfortunately, so I'm going to have to leave it there. Anyway, you guys take care of yourself. Have a great day.